I never thought in a million years that I would be making this video. Out of all of the Primarchs, out of all of the agendas, out of all of the characters I could spend hours shamelessly glazing, I genuinely never thought I'd be sitting here defending Leman Russ, the Wolf King. And yet, here we are. Now, for those of you who have been around the channel for a while, you know that I've not exactly been the president of the Space Wolves fan club. In fact, I've spent a good portion of my existence slandering this man. But at a certain point, I've got to give credit where credit is due. Because when you actually sit down and look at Leman Russ's feats, his statements, and the Primarchs he's fought throughout the heresy, you start running into a very uncomfortable reality. This man is kind of cracked. Yes, I said it.
No, God!
So in today's video, against my better judgment, my personal bias, and probably against the will of a vast majority of the herd, I'm going to do something I never thought possible. I'm going to push the Leman Russ agenda. And that if he were to return in the modern setting of Warhammer 40K, there is a very real argument that he could be one of, if not the, strongest Primarch currently walking the galaxy. By the end of this video, you're either going to embrace the Leman Russ agenda, or you're going to find yourself getting buckshanked by the Dionysian spear. So without further ado, let's jump headfirst into the gaol. Because Emperor help me, it's time to unleash the wolves and push the Leman Russ agenda. So before I start pushing this agenda, as always, what exactly is an agenda? In power scaling, an agenda is basically when someone picks their favorite character and builds the strongest possible case for them using feats, statements, and lore, while maybe conveniently not focusing too hard on their anti-feats. Now normally, this is where I'd happily start glazing one of my favorite characters. But the problem is that today we're talking about Leman Russ. And as most of you probably already know, I think he's a total loser and an absolute moron. Which means I'm about to spend the next hour or so defending a Primarch I've spent years slandering. Truly, this is my darkest hour. So we're going to start with some statements that truly upscale Papa Wolf here. First off, Leman Russ believes he could beat most of his brother Primarchs, as seen in the book Wolfsbane. In the old days, during the Crusade, I thought I could beat most of my brothers. Maybe not Sanguinius, in him there is a fine blend of skill and fury. He is a berserk and angel's garb, or the Night Haunter, for he has the heedless power of the insane. But the others, Angron, he's too angry. Fulgrim, he shrugged, too proud. Perturabo and Dorn, too stolid. Guilliman is too stern to enjoy battle, and so I would beat him too. Lorgar I could spit on, and that would drop him into the dirt. He's so weak from all that kneeling. Alfarius is a wretched serpent, and we all know what happened to the great sorcerer of Prospero. The rest I could defeat as easily as this. He snapped his fingers. So yeah, Russ thinks he could beat Angron, Dorn, Perturabo, Fulgrim, Guilliman, Lorgar, which is, no surprise, or even Alfarius. Yes, there are some notable exceptions, but one of them is Sanguinius, who is, he's dead. And the other exception is Conrad Kurz, who I will admit is pretty cracked, as he has the power of precognition, allowing him to briefly see into the future. Though you could make the argument that Russ might still prevail over the Night Haunter. Why do I say this? Well, if you compare Russ and the Lions fight, where they fought for a full day and night, with both of them seeming to be relative to each other, to Kurz's various fights with the Lion, which never lasted anywhere near that long. There is at least an argument to be made that Russ could potentially hang with or even defeat Conrad Kurz. Now, am I going to die on that hill today? No. Because of two reasons. One, I love my Buki Kurz more than anything, besides maybe Magnus the Red. But two, for the purposes of this agenda, Conrad Kurz is also, he's dead as well. Now, isn't that convenient? statement. In addition to this statement, there is also a similar one in the book Vengeful Spirit, when Russ speaks to Loken about confronting Horus. "Horus Lubercal will kill you," said Loken. Had he named any other individual, Loken had no doubt the Wolf King would have torn his throat out before he'd even known what was happening. Instead, Russ nodded. "You're right," he said, his eyes taking on a distant look as he relived old battles. "I fought every one of my brothers over the centuries, either in training or with bloody blade. I know for a fact that I can kill any one of them if I had to. But Horus?" Russ shook his head, and his next words were spoken like a shameful confession, each one a bitter curse. "He's the only one I don't know if I can beat." So yet again, Russ states that he can beat any of his brother Primarchs, with another exception this time around being Horus Lubercal, who himself has a shit ton of statements saying that he is the greatest among the Primarchs and one of the most skilled. And I'm not even kidding, this bald fella here is the king of statements. One could say he is a statement merchant. And I legit made a whole entire video on this very issue months ago. So if you want to see how ridiculous these statements get, go check out that video here. But in regards to this excerpt, it really isn't the worst thing in the world that Russ doesn't think that he can beat Horus. Since if there is one brother Russ would be unsure about, Horus is probably the safest answer out there. But funnily enough, in the book Wolfsbane, which canonically occurs after Vengeful Spirit, Russ actually takes back his own statement and says that he could have beaten Horus after all. Horus, though he grimaced, put to it one-on-one, I could have beaten him. It would have been hard and close fought, and had fortune favored him over me, he would have triumphed. But the feat was within my grasp. So pretty much, Russ has repeatedly stated that he believes he could pretty much beat all of his brothers, and eventually even comes around to the idea that Horus himself was not beyond his ability to defeat. Now whether Russ is right is another discussion entirely. Some of you are probably thinking, okay Cal, that's cool and all, but those statements are coming from Russ himself. There's probably a bit of bias there. And you know what? That's a fair point, Herd. Russ is not exactly known for being humble. The man has enough confidence to fill the Fang 3 times over. But what's even nuttier than supposedly being stronger than most of the Primarchs is some of the feats attached to the Wolf King's name. Like for example, according to Games Workshop's 500 Facts You Probably Didn't Know, fact 168, the Space Wolves Primarch Leman Russ once defeated a Warlord Titan by leaping from a building onto its carapace and beheading it with a single blow of his great blade, Mjolnir.
Look, up in the sky, it's a bird!
It's a plane!
It's Leman Russ, flying across the night sky like a fairy, as he torpedoes towards a Warlord Titan. And I'm assuming you had no idea this list existed. I'll drop it down in the description and the comments. But all the facts found on this list are canon, which is kind of a weird way to introduce some feats. But hey, Games Workshop is kinda kooky sometimes. But yeah, this is an absolutely absurd feat when you actually think about what a Warlord Titan is. These are some of the largest and most heavily armored war machines in the entire Imperium, standing dozens of meters tall and carrying enough firepower to level entire cities. Before you can even touch the physical structure, you first have to deal with the void shield surrounding it. These localized energy barriers are designed to absorb a huge amount of punishment, from lasers, missiles, and virtually every conventional form of attack by displacing that energy into the warp. And then, even if you somehow get through those shields, you're still dealing with meters thick layers of adamantium armor, reinforced plating, and one of the most durable machines ever constructed by mankind. And Russ apparently looked at all of that and decided, nah, I'd win. The fact that he was able to leap on top of a Titan, reach its head, and decapitate it with a single swing is honestly one of the craziest physical strength feats attributed to any Primarch.
Wanna see me run to that mountain and back? You wanna see me do it again?
Now admittedly, we don't get the full context surrounding this feat, but regardless of the sudden circumstances, it's pretty silly that Games Workshop felt comfortable putting this into an official publication material. And that tells us that Russ has always been portrayed as a monster in combat. And folks, that's actually the perfect segue into our next section, as statements and titan-killing feats are cool and all, but what really matters is how Russ performs against the beings he's constantly compared to, his brothers, the other Primarchs. As across 40k, Leman Russ has 4 fights against the other Primarchs. First, against the Lion in the book The Great Wolf. Second, against Angron in the book Betrayer. Third, against Magnus the Red in the book A Thousand Suns. And lastly, his fight against Post-Moloch Horus in the book Wolfsbane. And if I'm being quite honest, these fights are the sole reason the Leman Russ agenda exists. Let's go through each of them and break them down one by one, starting with his fight against Lionel Johnson in the book The Great Wolf. The reason this duel occurs at all is honestly pretty funny, since Russ gets pissed at the Lion for pretty much stealing his kill. And of course, being the man-children that the Primarchs are, the obvious solution is apparently to settle the matter by beating the shit out of each other. And beat the shit out of each other they did. What's important about this fight is the fact that neither Primarch is holding back, as the novel tells us directly. So they fought again, on and on, neither relenting, neither holding back. So this wasn't a sparring match or a friendly duel. This was 2 Primarchs genuinely going all out. And it quickly turned into one of the longest Primarch fights in the setting, as the pair fight for a full day and night. But early on, I will say that Russ actually suffers a pretty notable setback. Then the Lion struck, hauling his blade around crossways, only to drive it up at the last minute. Russ's counterstrike came in too high, and Kraken Maw was wrenched, spitting from his grasp. Perhaps the Lion thought that this might have been an end to it, for he never followed up with the strike that would have surely have driven deep into Russ's exposed chest. But the Wolf King had other ideas. So the Lion completely disarms Russ, and as the text states, he could have capitalized on this opening. If you're looking for anti-feats, this is probably the biggest one in their entire fight. And you could absolutely argue that Russ should have lost right here. The problem is that Leman Russ immediately responds by doing the most Leman Russ thing you could possibly imagine. Snarling with rage, Russ barged headlong into his brother, turning his entire body into a weapon. From there, the duel escalates into an all-out slugfest. The 2 Primarchs trade blows for hours, neither able to gain a decisive advantage over the other. For example, we have moments like this. Russ was the stronger of the 2 by a fraction, powering Kraken Maw with the greater heft and momentum. But the Lion had the superior dexterity, angling his parries and thrusts to catch Russ off balance. This directly tells us that Russ is physically stronger than the Lion, even if only by a small margin, while at the same time, the Lion is portrayed as the superior technical duelist. And I think that might be the perfect way to describe their differences. The Lion is the better swordsman, Russ is the better brawler. But despite their different fighting styles, the 2 are close enough in power that neither can decisively overcome the other. And folks, that's not the only Russ upscale packed into this duel, as throughout their fight, Russ is able to match speed with the Lion. When they moved to strike, it was godlike, blurred by speed, locked into perfect precision, weighted to cause apocalyptic levels of damage. This makes it appear that both Russ and the Lion are similar to each other in speed, and remember who we're talking about here, people. This is the Lion. The same Primarch who in Savage Weapons was able to outright blitz Conrad Kurz, despite Kurz possessing Future Sight. Which essentially means the Lion moves so fast that Kurz's precognition couldn't keep up. And here we have Russ keeping pace with him blow for blow. That alone is a massive upscale. Their fight eventually becomes so violent that both Primarchs are thrown from the fortress they're fighting in, and the 2 crash through the outer walls over 50 meters below, smashing through stone and fortifications before finally coming to a stop. That's roughly 164 feet from my fellow Americans. And neither of them really seems to care. They simply get back up and keep fighting. By the end of the duel, both Primarchs have lost their weapons and are reduced to beating each other with their bare fists. Eventually, Russ sees an opening, and the text outright tells us that Russ has the chance to capitalize and potentially finish the fight. For a moment, all Russ saw was the opportunity. That last impact had nearly taken his brother's helm clean off. He could leap to his feet, shove him back to the parapet's edge, press the advantage, and beat him down to his knees. But instead of taking it, he begins laughing at the sheer absurdity of what they're doing, which is pretty fair to be honest. But unfortunately for him, the lion does not share his sense of humor, as he immediately punches Russ in the face and knocks him unconscious. So technically speaking, Russ loses the fight. But calling this some decisive lion victory would be incredibly misleading. The two fought for an entire day and night, while neither held back. Russ was physically stronger, the lion was the more skilled duelist, and by the end of it, they were still so evenly matched that the deciding blow came because Russ stopped fighting to laugh. Honestly, relative might be the best possible word to describe them. And that is incredibly important for this agenda, as the lion is not just any Primarch. He has statements comparing his martial skill to base Horus, has victories over Conrad Kurz throughout the Horus Heresy, and in the modern setting of 40k, has even defeated a demon Primarch, Angron, during Arc of Omens, although he did wield the Emperor's Shield. If I'm being truthful here, people, I think that base lion, during the height of the Great Crusade when he is unamped, unaltered, and not equipped with the Emperor's Shield, is a top 5 or dare I say a top 3 Primarch. And in the modern setting, the lion is probably one of, if not the strongest Primarchs. And some of that prowess, I will admit, comes from the Emperor's Shield, which seems to be able to deflect any attack, as we saw in his fight with Angron. So if Russ can go toe-to-toe with the lion while neither is holding back, then right away we're talking about a Primarch who belongs in the highest tiers of the base Primarchs, possibly in the top 5 as well, since if he's relative to the lion, he has to belong in that same conversation. It's kinda crazy that by analyzing one fight, you can immediately upscale Russ. Russ better give Lion a hug when he comes back. But now we move on to a fight that completely divides the fandom. Yeah, you guessed it. Oh boy, oh my. This is one of the most controversial Primarch fights of all time. Leman Russ vs. Angron in the book Betrayer.
Stop it.
Stop! Stop it! Leave that man alone!
Let me first preface by saying there are multiple ways people view this fight. Some believe Angron straight up beat Russ. Others argue Russ never intended to defeat Angron and was instead trying to show him the error of the butcher's nails. As of right now, you could truthfully argue either side, since there isn't definitive proof for either argument. If we look at the surface level of their duel, here's what happens. Angron has just finished massacring an entire population, which is probably the least surprising thing Angron has ever done, when Leman Russ arrives to confront him over the butcher's nails. The two exchange insults, tempers flare, and before long, the discussion evolves into a Primarch fistfight, as all healthy family discussions should. This is how Angron recounts the battle to Lorgar. My blade broke, but it didn't matter. I pulled his chainsword from his fist and broke it in my hands. We fell into the mud brawling. We'd both known that fight would end up on the ground. I had him, Lorgar, my boot on his throat. At the very end, I stood above him at last, and Russ had to crawl away, fang teeth clenched, breathing spit as much as breath. Strings of it tumbled from his cracked lips with each rasping exhalation. Angron chased as the Wolf King staggered to his feet, but Russ opened his arms wide, offering no fight. "Do you see?" he said. No, he barked it. He barked it not like a simple beast, but with human passion backed by canine ferocity. Conviction burned in his eyes, the same instinctive viciousness of a dog defending its family. "Look, damn you, look around you. Do you see what you've done to your sons?" "My men are dying," Russ admitted. "Yet here we stand at the battle's heart, and only one legion is about to lose its Primarch. Do you see how you've broken your sons?" He threw an arm to take in a wide pass of the battlefield. "The wolves are soldiers taking an objective. They fight to win, while your world eaters fight only to kill." So on the very surface of this fight, Angron appears to have beaten Leman Russ. He gets the better of their duel and ends up standing over him. But there's also the very obvious fact that Russ successfully proves the point that he came to make. The World Eaters were winning the battle, sure, but Angron was losing the war. his legion had become so consumed by the butcher's nails that they had completely abandoned strategy, cohesion, and even basic concern for their own Primarch survival. As in his rage, Angron had effectively been led into a trap by Russ. And had the Wolf King truly wished to end the fight, the surrounding Space Wolves were already in position to gun him down, while the World Eaters showed little concern for protecting their Primarch. And Lorgar himself seems to agree with this interpretation. No, Lorgar was almost breathless in disbelief. No. Angron, you stubborn fool. None of that matters. His men, Angron, his legion could have killed you. Whether the Emperor ordered it or not, Russ spared your life. He didn't retreat in shame, you arrogant, Lorgar sighed. He was probably lamenting your thick skull all the way back to Terra, hoping you'd heed a rather consummate lesson in brotherhood and loyalty. Look what happened. Yes, you beat him in a duel. Yes, your men took down more of his than his of yours. And yet, who won the battle? The World Eaters. Angron said without hesitation. Lorgar just stared at him for several seconds. I appreciate that every living being must, by the nature of perception, understand and process life in a different way. But even for you, brother, this is achingly obtuse. Now, this definitely shows that Russ was trying to teach Angron a lesson, which does support that perhaps Leman Russ wasn't going all out. But instead of trying to look at this fight in a dozen different ways, I think the better approach is to compare how both Primarchs did against a common foe. Yep, you guessed it, Horus, the Bald Menace, who both Primarchs fought at some point during the heresy. Let's start with Angron, who fights Horus during the book Dropside Massacre, before the Battle of Istvan V. And let me tell you guys, this one is not a good look for Angron, as their fight is not close at all. Horus has let go of Worldbreaker. The Great Mace falls. Horus catches the haft of Angron's first axe. Then the claws of his other hand slash down. Karn had not seen the blades unfold. They slice through the chain binding the axe to Angron's wrists, as Horus twists the weapon free from his brother's grip and slices it back at Angron. Its chain blade meets that of the second axe. Mecha teeth jam into each other. Chain drive shriek, Worldbreaker hits the floor. A stalemate, but not really. A demonstration that Horus could have ended the fight already, could have ended it with a deathstroke, but instead had chosen to take Angron's own blade. So Angron loses to Horus. But some additional context to this fight, which makes it even worse, is the fact that Horus isn't even trying to kill Angron. He's trying to prove a point. And the text even confirms outright that Horus could have killed Angron if he so wished, but instead opted for a demonstration of strength rather than the killing blow. On the other hand though, when Russ fights a stronger form of Horus, post-Molech Horus in the book Wolfsbane, which, don't worry, I'll be covering that fight in a little bit, Russ actually performs drastically better, even going as far as to wound him with the Dionysian spear. Now yes, that spear does matter, because it's implied to interfere with Horus's vast chaos empowerment. But even if we factor that in and say that the spear was nerfing Horus to as low as his base state, then both versions of Horus, the one Angron fought in Dropside Massacre and the one Leman Russ fought in Wolfsbane, should be damn near close to each other in strength and raw power. And while Horus seemingly low-diffed Angron, meanwhile Leman Russ actually managed to wound him and put up a decent fight. So what is the takeaway from this long schizophrenic rant? Well, it pains me to say it, but it makes far more sense that Russ was not trying to kill Angron in Betrayer. Angron was fighting to win the duel, but Russ was fighting to prove a point. Angron beat him up, sure, but Russ also maneuvered him into a position where he could have died if the Space Wolves were ordered to pull the trigger. Which means that while I do think Angron won their duel, I don't think Russ was going all out, or like all Space Wolf fans like to say, he didn't have the intent to kill him. Gosh, I really can't believe that came out of my mouth. Who am I? Who am I? You could even go as far to say that if there was a rematch and Russ was trying to kill Angron, that based on the performances against Horus, then Russ may have a very good chance of winning. So that's 2 fights analyzed, 2 to go. And we're still not done with controversial fights, because next up is Magnus the Red, who Leman Russ fights in the book A Thousand Suns. This fight occurs because Magnus broke the Council of Nicaea and used sorcery to try to warn the Emperor of Horus's impending betrayal, resulting in the webway being breached and everything pretty much going to hell. But before we get into this fight, I have a couple of things to say. First off, Magnus of course did nothing wrong. And well, second, his hair has the best flow of all the Primarchs. Period.
Dear God in heaven. So beautiful.
Thirdly, there seem to be a ton of in-universe interpretations of this fight. Like for example, in Horus Heresy Book 7, Inferno, we see various different descriptions of how this fight went down. But in today's video, I will strictly be using Azek Ahriman's point of view from the book A Thousand Suns. Now to add a little bit more additional context to this fight, it appears that Magnus the Red was weakened before this fight went down. As we get this statement from A Thousand Suns, which states, Magnus rose to his full height, his body diminished from its former glory, as though a fundamental part of him had been left on Terra after his confrontation with his father. So as we know in canon, Magnus indeed lost a portion of his soul after breaching the webway. Which soul, you may ask? Well, it's the noble aspect of Magnus the Red. And if you don't believe me, we have this excerpt from the book The Last Son of Prospero, which supports it, stating, one of many. The Crimson King had been broken, shattered like a mere throne in anger. It had began when he breached the wards on Terra, and it was ended by the Wolf's Wrath. So it definitely appears that Magnus was weakened in some capacity. I say some capacity because it's almost impossible to quantify how much weaker he was. We do have this statement from Crimson King when Magnus says, I fight with Horus only until we break open my father's palace. And when its gates are sundered and its vaults forced, I will reclaim the first and greatest shard of my soul held prisoner beneath it. Making it very plausible that Magnus was significantly weakened. But once again, we can't quantify it. But the fact remains that Magnus wasn't at full strength. Sorry guys, sorry, even if this is a Leman Russ agenda-pushing video, I still have to support my boy, Magnus the Red. But even with this caveat, Magnus still didn't expect to make it out of this duel alive. With the text even stating Magnus had no expectation of surviving his duel with Leman Russ. Now whether that's because of Russ's reputation, Magnus's own desire to die, or some combination of both, it certainly doesn't paint the picture of a Primarch expecting an easy victory. Once again showing how fearsome of a reputation Russ has. Then their fight begins as time slows and reality splits apart around the pair as they rain blow after blow upon each other. Anyone who attempts to intervene is struck down, even Custodes and other Space Wolves. As the text states, this was a battle fought on every level, physical, mental, and spiritual, with each Primarch bending every ounce of their almost limitless power to the other's destruction. And even though Leman Russ is fighting Magnus the Red, the second strongest Psyker in the galaxy, he is able to tank several of Magnus's psychic attacks. Ahriman had cautioned his warriors not to wield their powers for fear of the flesh change. But Magnus showed no such restraint and battered Leman Russ with fists wreathed in fire and lightning. Russ was a Primarch, and such powers as could shatter armies had little effect on him save to drive him into higher fits of rage. This is honestly pretty insane for Leman Russ, as we see a stronger form of Magnus, Demon Primarch Magnus, had the capability to easily damage and outright atomize Vulcan in the book Echoes of Eternity. And we see Leman Russ easily tanking psychic strikes that the text literally states were capable of shattering an army. And Russ appears to tank it easily, only angering him more. The two begin to wound each other more and more, as Magnus smashes Russ's chest, who responds by snapping Magnus the Red's arm into 1,000 pieces, before Russ is in turn impaled by a blade of pure thought. Russ's wolves jump in to save him, and then Russ lashes out blindly with his sword, and stabs Magnus in his only eye. Yikes. Ahriman cried out as he saw Magnus reel back from the Wolf King, one hand clutched to his eye as his shattered arm crackled with regenerative energies. As broken and bloodied as Leman Russ was, he was a brawler enough to seize his opportunity. He barreled into Magnus and gripped him around the waist like a wrestler, roaring as he lifted his brother's body high above his head. All eyes turned to Russ as he brought Magnus down across his knee, and the sound of the Crimson King's back-breaking tore through every warrior of the Thousand Suns' heart. So what's the takeaway from this fight besides Leman Russ banning my Buki? Well, it's quite simple. Leman Russ defeated the strongest base Primarch. Sure, there is some context involved as Magnus wasn't at full strength, Leman Russ's wolves aided him in his fight, and the Custodes and Space Wolves attempted to intervene. But even with all of this context, the majority of this fight is still Magnus and Leman Russ straight up facing each other down. And that's what makes this feat so impressive. Because Magnus is the Psychic Primarch. This is the same character who could project his consciousness across the galaxy, throw around Eldar Titans, and like I mentioned earlier, he atomized another Primarch in Echoes of Eternity. Even as a proud member of the Magnus the Red fan club, very few Primarchs could endure his psychic might, described as capable of shattering armies, trade blows with him physically, and still capitalize on an opening when it appeared. And whether you think Magnus was operating at, say, 90%, 75%, or even half of his true power, that's still one hell of a win for the Wolf King. Then finally we come to his last Primarch fight. And I kind of briefly touched on this earlier, but it's against post-Molech Horus in the book Wolfsbane. This fight occurs when Russ attacks Horus as a desperate strategic gamble to decapitate the traitor war effort. And before we get into this fight, I think you guys clearly need to know how powerful post-Molech Horus is. Because let me tell you guys, he is incredibly powerful. And it's not a hyperbole to say that he's stronger than base Magnus the Red. Don't believe me? Well, here are some pretty insane statements from the book Vengeful Spirit that really show how broken he has become. Horus gains this new form when he enters the same warp portal the Emperor entered to treat with the Chaos Gods on the world of Molech. Here the Emperor gained immense power and the knowledge to create the Primarchs. And Horus does something similar, but in a very different way from the Emperor, as the Emperor entered the warp as an equal and treated with the gods. Horus, on the other hand, entered the portal to gain the favor of the Chaos Gods. He did not barter as an equal. And so within the warp, time dilated, and he spent what felt like eons battling and proving his worth to the ruinous Pantheon, eventually gaining the Chaos Gods' respect, and in return, immense psychic power. And when he finally returns to real space, only moments have passed, but he is visibly changed. The War Master had aged. What Axamon had taken to be cold flesh was the power of the Inferium, distilled and honed within the body of an immortal being. Horus stood taller, fuller, and more powerfully than before. Lupercal had always found War Master to be an awkward fit, a term never fully bedded in or taken as read. Now he owned the title, as though it had been his long before there was any such office to take. He was now, naturally and without equivocation, the War Master. Axamon, Abaddon, and Kybri backed away from Horus, each of them dropping to their knees in wonder as the power filling the Primarch bloomed in the material world. Even Mortarion, that most truculent of Primarchs, bent the knee to Horus in a way he had never done for the Emperor. Horus grinned, and all trace of the war-weary ancient was banished in the blink of an eye. In his place was a mortal god, brighter and more dangerous than ever, filled with a power that only one other being in all existence had wielded before. Yes, said Horus, I found exactly what I was looking for. Yeah, you heard that right. Horus at this point is literally filled with a power that only one other being in existence has wielded before. And whether you interpret that as being equal to the Emperor or merely approaching that level, the point remains the same. Post-Molech Horus is on an entirely different scale than before, and now far beyond any other Primarch. And what's even crazier is that this version of Horus is not even his strongest form, as he gains even more power in the book Slaves to Darkness. But I don't really want to go down that cow hole in this video. I'll probably tackle it in another installment. Because even at this stage, Horus is already incredibly powerful. Axamon even describes him like this. Horus had always been a demigod among men, but looking into the War Master's eyes now is like looking into the heart of a star on the verge of becoming a self-immolating supernova. And to add to that, when Loken sees Horus for the first time in ages, he thinks this. That power, that essence was magnified now. It was magnified 100-fold, truly showing how strong Horus has become since his base level. This is the version of Horus that Russ fights. And well, I'm gonna admit it, even as Russ's biggest hater, he does pretty damn well in this fight. But there is once again some context we've got to talk about first. And it comes in the form of a giant-ass golden spear known as the Dionysian Spear. This spear was forged by the Emperor himself and contains a portion of his might. This spear has the ability to illuminate those it pierces, revealing to them some aspect of the truth. In Wolfsbane, we see it do some pretty crazy stuff. Like for example, it seems to shoot out traces of blue lightning. His ability with the blade kept the War Master back, and for once he was glad of a spear's reach. The weapon lent him arcane power of his own, each thrust arced with blue lightning that stabbed at the ground. Sheets of light trailed its blade as he swept it round his head to slash at his brother. So the spear is clearly empowered by the Emperor and is able to unleash supernatural lightning and attacks. But even more importantly, wherever the spear struck, Chaos Corruption seems to retreat or weaken. Where the lightning caught upon the corrupted surfaces of the hall, filth curled back and the warp decoration twisted. When the spear sheared into the unholy light surrounding Horus, it shrank away, writhing from the spear's edge. Truly the Emperor had gifted him with a portion of his own might, meaning that Horus was probably being hindered to some degree by the spear. But I don't think this makes the feat any less impressive for the Wolf King, because like I said earlier, Horus is operating on an entirely different level by this point. And despite this, Russ is still able to react to, keep up with, and trade blows against this version of Horus. Russ drove in with a series of lateral strikes, swinging the spear like a sword. Horus parried with his claw, each dash of metal on metal, like the peals of a bell heralding the end of the world. Russ howled. Horus laughed into the face of a cry that would have slain a mortal man. Russ's ferocity he found harder to counter. The Primarch of the Space Wolves jabbed hard towards Horus's sides, below his palstron, where the armor was thinnest. The War Master moved aside. He was lumbering in his Terminator suit, but anticipated Russ's attack early enough to avoid them all. Horus's lightning claw punched forward, seeking to rip Russ's head from his shoulders. The Primarch moved, but not completely out of the way, allowing Horus to grab his pauldron. Now this blow does leave Russ at Horus's mercy, but in Horus's arrogance, Russ is able to exploit a brief opening. And with the Dionysian Spear, that's all you really need.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
As Russ manages to stab Horus in his side, and immediately the effects of the Dionysian Spear take hold. Still screaming light, Horus staggered back, releasing Russ in his attempt to dislodge the blade. Russ would not relent, and went with him, grinding the weapon in the wound. The War Master gripped the shaft of the Emperor's spear, desperate to keep it from cutting deeper. The scream ended, the white-hot light of his wounded soul cut out, and he fell to his knees, head bowed. When Horus looked up, the unholy aura had gone from around his head. The absolute confidence he had displayed a few moments before was absent. His flesh hung slackly upon his skull. He had aged 1,000 years in a moment. This results in Horus being wounded and temporarily stripped of the ruinous power's gifts. And for a brief moment, the real Horus surfaces. The War Master on his knees, and his unholy aura gone, recognizes Russ as his brother once again, and speaks with regret rather than arrogance. So Russ has effectively succeeded. The spear has done exactly what it was designed to do. But instead of, taking the killing blow and ending the Horus heresy, Russ hesitates. And in that hesitation, Horus is able to regain his power and launches a devastating counterattack, mortally wounding Russ and leaving him on the verge of death.
You had one job.
Russ only survives because the Space Wolves begin throwing themselves at Horus in waves, sacrificing their lives to buy their Primarch time to escape. But the biggest takeaway from this fight is not the fact that Russ failed, but that he succeeded far beyond what anyone expected him to do. Remember folks, Russ himself went into this battle believing he was going to die. He wasn't marching onto the vengeful spirit expecting to beat Horus in a fair fight. He was just trying to buy the Imperium one last chance at survival. And yet despite all of that, he is still able to react to, keep up with, and even wound Horus. Sure, he's equipped with a weapon that is specifically designed to exploit chaos corruption. And yes, the Dionysian spear means that one good hit is all he really needs. But that doesn't change the fact that he still has to land that hit in the first place. I will once again remind you that this is Russ essentially taking on a being that is on par with or somewhat below the Emperor in power. Horus at this point is stronger than any of the other Primarchs in the entire heresy, even taking into account the Demon Primarchs, the Lion, and Sanguinius. A Horus whose very presence causes other Primarchs to kneel before him. A Horus whose power is repeatedly described as being 100-fold his base state. And Russ still manages to keep pace with him. He still manages to wound him, and for a brief moment, he has the War Master completely at his mercy. But fighting the strongest Primarchs isn't the only thing upscaling this agenda. Because Leman Russ also, drumroll please, has psychic abilities as well. Yes, you heard me right, psychic abilities. Which you have to admit is kind of hilarious because this is the same guy who was so against Psykers that he helped push the Council of Nicaea into banning them. And now the irony is that buried beneath all of that wolf fury, he's carrying psychic powers of his own.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Oh, you gotta be shitting me. Yes, if you guys already didn't know, Leman Russ, just like his greatest rival, Magnus the Red, is a pretty powerful psyker. Now, of course, all of the Primarchs are psychic in some capacity, but most of their abilities are hidden traits, like Guilliman's, which allows him to process an obscene amount of data and information all at once, or Perturabo's, which allows him to see the weakness in all things. Leman Russ, however, legitimately has psychic abilities. In fact, he was even trained by the Emperor himself, as seen in the book Wolf King. There had been no understanding of this on Terra. The Emperor, the Allfather, his shifting visage, always impossible to read, had kept him in isolation for a long time, doling out information in morsels, teaching him to use power armor, to command starships, to control the warp awareness that ran through his veins as thickly as his hyper-oxygenated blood. So Russ should have a pretty good amount of knowledge on the warp in general. But even with this training, I can't say for sure if Russ knows exactly how to use his powers directly. It may be more that Russ uses his psychic gifts instinctively as an extension of his martial fury. And if I'm wrong about that, feel free to correct me down in the comments. I tried to find examples of Russ consciously using his warp abilities or actively channeling his powers, but most of the examples I found seem to suggest they manifest based on the Wolf King's emotions or instincts rather than deliberate psychic discipline. Regardless though, these psychic powers seem to primarily manifest as elemental storms and blasts of wind and ice. For example, in the book Scars, we see him conjure an icy wind blast. The gale came from nowhere, as if the chamber wall had been punched out to the void. The force of it knocked him sideways, flooring him once more. His vision reeled and his helm cracked hard against the deck. He heard what sounded like thunder breaking, followed by the actinic crackle of energy weapons igniting. With a lurch of recognition, he realized the rush was not that of decompression, nor was it natural. The winds that howled across the chamber had the ice-rimmed redolence of Asaheim. Yep, that's right, these winds are powerful enough to knock a Space Marine off his feet. And Space Marines weigh around 2 tons. Or for example, in the book The Great Wolf, he whips up a powerful windstorm that tosses men around and rips through metal. He never finished. Even as he gained his feet, the entire chamber was rocked by a blast of ice-cold wind. A tearing, gnawing gale that swirled across the battlefield, ripping troopers from their positions and sending them cartwheeling. "Leave it," came the command, resounding from every wall. From the height of the dome and the depths of the cogitator shafts, as hard as hoarfrost, in the storm's wake, Leman Russ strode across the expanse. His pelts flying about him, the ruins of his battle plate flaring like comet fire. But even beyond his elemental powers, Russ is stated to be a master of Fenrisian ruins, which have power over the warp. The Fenrika knew, as they had always known, that the cuts warded against the Soul Eaters, for the Underrealm was made of ideas, and every idea was a word, and every word had its ruin. Thus, the work was not decoration, it was metaphysics. The Primarch Leman Russ knew all this. He knew it as completely as any living soul, and understood more of the ways of the ruins than even the greatest of his smiths. For he was made of the same stuff from which the tapestry of fate was woven, and the ruins penetrated his being in a way that none of his warriors would ever truly understand. This would give Russ an inherently much stronger defense against the warp and warp-based attacks, which does help explain why he was able to fight Magnus the Red for such a long period of time and even come out ahead of him. And finally, we see in A Thousand Suns that Russ also possesses a psychic scream of sorts that stuns, knocks out, mind breaks, or outright kills psychers from across Tiska during the burning of Prospero. It swept over them, a sudden, shocking blast of psychic noise that overwhelmed the senses with its sheer violence. A psychic shockwave, gasped Ufzar, one of immense proportions. Ahriman forced the pain away and knelt beside Lemuel. The Remembrancer's face was a mask of blood. It wet from his eyes and poured in a steady stream from his nose. "So strong?" asked Ahriman, still blinking away hazy after images. "Are you sure?" Ufzar nodded. "I am," he said. "It is a howl of pure rage, cold, jagged, and merciless." Ahriman trusted Ufzar's judgment, tasting icy metal and feeling the rage of a hunter's fury denied. "Such a force of psychic might is too powerful for any normal mind," said Ufzar, reliving a painful memory. "I have felt this before." Ahriman read Ufzar's aura and knew. "Leman Russ," he said. And Ahriman even says the following later. "Takar," said Ahriman, "tell me what is happening. We heard a psychic shout more powerful than anything I've ever known." So Ahriman here is literally claiming that this psychic attack was more powerful than anything he has ever experienced. And remember, Ahriman is a psyker from the Thousand Sun Legion and has seen Magnus the Red fight. I'll let you make your own conclusions from that statement, folks. So when we put this all together, Russ is far more than just a guy who hits things with an axe. He possesses powerful elemental warp manifestations, extensive knowledge of the warp, mastery over Fenrisian ruins, an inherent resistance to warp-based attacks, and a psychic howl potent enough to incapacitate some of the strongest psychers in the galaxy. And this brings us full circle, back to the agenda I'm pushing. Taking everything we've discussed, his betrayal as relative to the Lion, his victory over Magnus the Red, and his feat of keeping pace with and actually wounding post-Molech Horus, a version of the War Master operating far beyond any of the other Primarchs, add in his raw, brawling strength, skill, speed, and the fact that he's already demonstrated clear psychic abilities, and base Leman Russ is probably a top 5 or top 6 Primarch, depending on where you place Conrad Gers. Now imagine if Russ actually came back, and if there was ever a time for the Emperor's Executioner to return, it would be now. As the modern Imperium isn't dealing with the same threats it faced during the Great Crusade, there is endless war, endless chaos, and endless Xenos horrors. The Demon Primarchs have returned, Abaddon has broken Cadia, and the Great Rift has split the galaxy in half, which is honestly the perfect environment for Leman Russ. If Russ returns with his abilities intact and maybe even awakened, like Lionel Johnson with his Forest Walk or Corvus Corax with his shape-shifting shadow ability, then the Wolf King could become far stronger than he was during the Horus Heresy. We've already seen what he can do at his base peak. He endured psychic attacks from Magnus the Red that could shatter armies. He fought on equal footing with Lionel Johnson for an entire day and night, and he even managed to wound post-Molech Horus, being operating on a level far beyond any of the Primarchs. And that's without even using his psychic abilities. So what would happen if Russ follows a similar path like the Lion, coming back far more powerful than the warrior who vanished 10,000 years ago? Well, his base abilities would stay the same, meaning that his physical stats like speed, strength, skill, and brawling ability would be around equivalent to the Lion. And we've seen the Lion literally trade blows with Demon Primarch Angron, And additionally, if Russ comes back with his psychic abilities further enhanced, like say his Fenrisian ruins, or at the point where they can disrupt sorcery, weaken demonic entities, and even resist warp corruption on an entirely different level. Or maybe even his psychic howl has become so strong that it can now stagger demon Primarchs and even disrupt their connection to the warp. This would apply to all of his psychic abilities, like his elemental storm and warp awareness as well. Imagine how you would fare against the demon Primarchs. Magnus could unleash storms of psychic fire that can reduce armies to ash, but maybe Leman Russ's mastery of Fenrisian ruins blunt their power as he advances through the flames completely unharmed. Or imagine Angron charging across a battlefield with all of the fury of Khorne behind him. This is the same monster who can tear through armies and titans alike. But instead of facing the Russ of the heresy, he would face a hunter whose resistance against the warp has evolved over 10,000 years, making him a warrior who can withstand the madness pouring from the Red Angel and meet him blow for blow, before combining his great strength and psychic abilities to bring Angron down. Or picture Fulgrim, the Phoenician, dancing through combat with impossible speed, striking from a dozen angles while he wields his warp sorcery to twist reality. But against Russ, well, Fulgrim now faces a Primarch whose instincts are as sharp as ever, whose psychic awareness has grown far stronger, and whose entire existence has become uniquely suited to hunting creatures born of the warp. And that is the heart of my agenda, people. We've already seen the Lion return stronger than he was during the heresy, and start putting demon Primarchs down in the ground. So, when you stack Leman Russ's feats, his anti-warp abilities, his psychic powers, and whatever gifts 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror may have given him, you can see why there is a legitimate argument that the Wolf King could return as the strongest Primarch in the entire setting. God, I really can't believe I said that. And I could see two ways Games Workshop could bring him back. The first is as the Wolfren King. After thousands of years spent in or around the Eye of Terror, his genetics may have continued to mutate and evolve, not into a servant of chaos, mind you, but into something uniquely adapted to fighting the ruinous powers. He would be faster, stronger, more savage, and more resistant to the warp than ever before. His senses would be far beyond anything in the universe, and he could track warp-spawn beings across time and space. What I'm kinda getting at is he would be a loyalist Primarch version of Karnak, but instead, he would be hunting down all of the demon Primarchs across the warp, time, and space, using his enhanced senses to find them regardless of where they are. The second is the Odin route. Leman Russ would return as a sage, having sacrificed his eye in the Eye of Terror in exchange for knowledge, just like Odin does in actual Norse mythology. He would come back not as a berserker king, but as a master of foresight, warding, psychic power, and the knowledge of the known universe. He would be a Primarch who understands the warp on a level few beings in the galaxy can match. He would still be every bit as deadly in combat, but now would be armed with wisdom and psychic abilities that would make him an even greater threat than ever before. And to be honest, either version would be absolutely terrifying for the demon Primarchs. Because whether Russ returns as the ultimate hunter or the wise old king, he would be arriving in a galaxy dominated by warp-born enemies. And if he returns like I theorized, then Leman Russ would have a lot of prey to hunt. And if he somehow also got the Dionysian spear too, then yeah, the Wolf King would return as one bad mama Gemma. And folks, that is the Leman Russ agenda. After months of slandering Russ, I guess the Space Wolf fans deserve this one. I've also gotta be honest, I've been having a ton of fun writing these scripts, making agendas for each of the Primarchs. So far we've tackled the Lion, Rogel Dorn, Ferrus Manus, and now Leman Russ. As for what's next, I think we're going to be tackling Lorgar Aurelian. And I'm going to have to admit it's not going to be a good one for Wordbearer fans. But if there is another Primarch, character, faction, or agenda you'd like to see me cover, let me know down in the comments. And before we go, a massive shout out to my Patreon and YouTube members. Keydree, Tyler Pick 7, Girthquake 72, Immorally Bankrupt 1461, and Bossy Paul, Ritter S, Musty, Seth Capizilla, Lag, Cunning Carkle, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Anish Chatterjee, Jack Rohr, and Michael Skipper 7277. I appreciate you all so goddamn much, and I'll see you very soon when we continue the Chaos Gods miniseries. And since this concludes the Leman Russ agenda, regardless of where you are, even if it's the hospital, church, school, or work, if you see someone, let them know about the Russ agenda. Get really close in their personal space and whisper in their ear. Did you know that if Leman Russ returned with the Dionysian Spear, his psychic abilities awakened, and possibly a new warp power, he may indeed be the strongest Primarch in the current setting of Warhammer 40K. And you have to do it in that exact tone and voice, or I'm going to find you and milk you. But yeah, stay milked, fellas. I'll see you all real soon.